there's the engine compartment. There's from the back of the cab to the landing gear. And then there's the whole thing. Just plan on doing the whole thing, and then when you get there, if you only had the engine compartment, just worry about that. Or if you only had the back of the cab to the landing gear. Alright, but plan on doing the whole thing. You walk up, first thing you want to do is make sure it's not leaning to one side or the other. Make sure there's no obstructions around it. Make sure there's no puddles underneath. Come up. You got to make sure your headlights are clean and in proper working order. Make sure your grille is not obstructed. That means nothing in front of it. It's properly attached. No visual defects. That's going to be the one thing you're saying the most. If you forget, like say on the injector, if you forget what you're looking for, no visual defects covers everything. But try to remember, if something has fluid, you're checking for leaks. Air lines, you want to make sure they're not leaking. Radiator hoses, they're not leaking. Check your bumper, make sure it's properly attached, no missing or broken bolts. Make sure your tag's properly attached, up to date and clean. Check your headlight, make sure it's clean, proper working order, turn signal. On this truck, don't forget your mirror, make sure it's properly attached, clean and adjusted. Who's that farting over there already? Why is everybody walking away from you?
The Sandro.
Alright. And the easiest way to open this hood, a lot of people are trying to jump up here with both feet. The easiest way is one foot and just use your weight to pull it back. Alright. Now you always want to start from in here, work your way that way. That way you don't miss anything. First thing, go ahead and check your hood spring and retention cable. Make sure they're properly attached. There's no visual defects, no frays or anything. Check your hood hinge. Make sure no missing or broken bolts, no cracks, no visual defects. Now, this has got an AC condenser and an AC compressor. We're not going to worry about those at all. They are not on the test. So you're going to go out here, check your intercooler. This is your intercooler. Make sure there's no cracks, no leaks, no obstructions, no visual defects. Come up here. These are harder to see than on a regular Spider truck. These are your radiator support rods. Make sure they're properly attached, no visual defects. I'd come straight across, check your boots for your intercooler. Make sure they're not cracked, the clamps are tight, no visual defects. Check your pipes, no visual defects. Come over here, this is your air cleaner housing. You want to check, make sure the air cleaner's clean, make sure the housing's properly attached, no visual defects. From here, I would go straight up. This has got your solenoid. Check, make sure the solenoid, all the wires are tight. The solenoid's tight against the firewall. No bare or broken wires. Any wire you see, you want to touch every wire, say you're checking, make sure they're properly connected. There's no bare or broken wires. Alright, right next to that, in that little pocket, is your wiper motor, windshield wiper motor. Make sure it's properly attached. The wires are properly connected, no bare or broken wires. Right next to that is your city horn. Make sure it's properly attached. No bare, broken wires, no visual defects. From there, you want to go up so you don't miss anything. Check your wiper arms. Make sure they're in good shape, no visual defects. Check your windshields. Make sure the windshields are clean, they're not cracked, no visual defects. From there, go up to your clearance lights. Make sure they're clean, they're proper working order, no visual defects. And then from there, go check your air horns. Make sure they're properly attached, no visual defects. All right, after you get all that up there, now you can continue right here. Check your radiator. There's going to be 4 fluids you need to check. Your radiator fluid, your engine oil, your power steering reservoir, and your windshield washer reservoir. So, check radiator, make sure there's no obstructions, no leaks. Check your fan. Make sure there's no broken or missing blades. Right behind your fan is your water pump. Check, make sure the water pump, no missing or broken bolts, no cracks, no leaks. All right, come out to here. Power steering reservoir. Make sure you have enough fluid. I check the fluid level. Make sure it's not leaking. Well, there's a little bit of fluid here, but I'll mention that when I get back. Check your injector pump. Make sure no missing broken bolts, no cracks, no leaks. Well, this has got a little bit of a leak. I'll mention that when I get back. Check your injector lines. Make sure the lines they're tight, they're not leaking, no visual defects. And then on the end of your injector lines are your injectors. Check your injectors, make sure they're tight, they're not leaking, no visual defects. All right, over here you have a fuel filter. That's what the F is for. Here's another fuel filter, F. Check, make sure they're not leaking, they're tight, no visual defects. Every wire you see, check, make sure they're properly connected, no bare, broken wires. Check your lines. Now, the difference between an air line and a hose, the lines are, feel how solid these lines are. A hose you can squeeze. A line is tight. So you're going to check those. This is your air compressor. It is gear driven. We'll make sure there's no broken bolts, no cracks, no leaks, no visual defects. Check your 3 foot of frame. Check it for cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. Now you're not going to be able to see it, but behind here is your starter. You need to mention your starter. You're going to check for, make sure it's tight up in there. No missing broken bolts. It's got a bunch of wires. Make sure the wires are tight. No bare or broken wires. You have to really get underneath the look, but that's your oil pan right there. You want to make sure the oil pan is tight, not leaking, no visual defects. Now there's one other thing you can't see. It's your transmission. See, I check my transmission bolts, make sure they're tight, no missing broken bolts, no cracks, no leaks because it has fluid in it. Check your steering rod. Make sure there's no excessive play. All right, going to check your spring hangers. There's 4 parts to this. Your spring hangers. Make sure no missing broken bolts, no cracks, no visual defects. Check your springs. Make sure your springs aren't broke, cracked, or misaligned. What holds your springs? Your U-bolts. Check, make sure the U-bolts are tight. There's no visual defects. What do your U-bolts hold to? The axle. Make sure the axle's not bent, cracked, no visual defects. All right, now right behind the axle is a tie rod. It ties the 2 set of wheels together. Make sure that it's tight, not bent, no visual defects. Check your shock. Make sure your shock's properly mounted, no visual defects. All right, this is your steering gearbox. Make sure there's no missing or broken bolts, no cracks, no leaks, no visual defects. This is your pitman arm. Make sure it's properly mounted, tight, no visual defects. This is your drag link. Easy to remember because it's being drugged behind the pitman arm. This is your steering arm. Make sure the steering arm is properly mounted, no visual defects. And then you got your steering knuckle. This piece right here. Right here. Make sure there's no visual defects. All right, now you'll work your way out. You're going to do your 4 brake parts. You got your air line, your brake pot, your slack adjuster, drum, and shoes. Then you work your way out here. You're going to go to your hub oiler. Now every axle except for the drive axle has a hub oiler. Make sure no missing broken bolts, no cracks, no leaks because it has fluid in there and you want to make sure it has a proper fluid level. Check your lug nuts and studs. Make sure they're tight. There's no missing or broken nuts or studs. Check your rims. You want to make sure they're not bent, they're not cracked, or have illegal welds. You want to check your valve stem. Make sure it's capped, not leaking, no visual defects. Now your front tires need to be a minimum of 4/32. No mismatched sizes or no mismatched bias or radial. Make sure there's no cuts or gouges and they're properly inflated. Now if you say all this on this side, you didn't miss nothing, they're going to say, all right, what's different on the other side? If they do not say what's different, that means you might have missed something and they're giving you another chance on the other side to make it up. Go over here. Like I said, if they don't say what's different, just start back up front. Name everything again. Your hood hinge, your hood spring, and retention cable. Your intercooler. Your radiator support rod. Your boots. Your clamps. You make sure the boots are not cracked. No visual defects. Alright. This is your alternator. You want to make sure your alternator is properly mounted. Wires are connected properly, no bare broken wires, your belts on it, and properly adjusted. While you're there, make sure your belt, no excessive wear, and it's properly adjusted. Alright, this right here is a water filter. It's got a W up here, if you ever forget. Now the only difference is the oil filter has a D. It's close to being an O, but check them, make sure they're not leaking. Well, there's a little bit of fluid on that. I'll mention that when I get back. All right, you got your turbo. Make sure no missing or broken bolts, no cracks, the clamps are tight, no visual defects. Right here you got your heater hoses. Make sure all the clamps are tight. There's no visual defects, no leaks. Here's where you're going to check your oil. Make sure you have the proper oil level. You got your windshield washer reservoir. Make sure you have enough fluid in it to clean your windshields. This is where you check your antifreeze. Right now it appears to be a little bit low. We'll make sure, the way you can tell is when it's full, that ball will be floating up top and you'll be able to see green in there. All right. Check all your wiring. Make sure the wire's all properly connected, no bare broken wires. Check your frame, 3 foot of frame, cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. Check your spring hangers, missing, broken bolts, cracks, no visual defects. What do your spring hangers do? They hold your springs. Check for cracked, broken, or misaligned springs. What holds your springs? Your U-bolts. Check your U-bolts, make sure they're tight, there's no visual defects. U-bolts hold to your axle. Make sure it's not bent, cracked, no visual defects. Check your tie rod on this end. Make sure it's tight, no visual defects. Check your shock. Make sure it's properly mounted, not leaking. 4 brake parts, your airline, brake pot, slack adjuster, drum and shoes. And that's all you have to say about them. You don't have to say you're checking for leaks. Just say you're checking the 4 brake parts. All right. Come out here. Going to check your hub oiler, proper fluid level. Make sure there are no missing or broken bolts, no cracks, no leaks, no visual defects. Check your nuts and studs. Make sure they're tight. There's no missing or broken nuts or studs. Check your rim. Make sure it's not bent, cracked, or has illegal welds. Check your valve stem. Make sure it's capped. It's not bent, it's not leaking, no visual defects. Front tires, minimum 4/32. Make sure they're not mismatched sizes or mismatched bias or radials. Make sure there's no cuts or gouges and they're properly inflated. You do all that under the hood. Oh, I did forget one thing. When you're up here checking your hood hinge and everything, don't forget to mention your wires for your headlights. Check and make sure they're properly connected. No bare or broken wires. All right, we'll close the hood. All right, over here. You're going to check your hood latch. Make sure your latches securely, no visual defects. Come over here. You want to check your hood hinge and your door handle. You're going to open and shut it a couple times. Make sure they both work properly. Check your mirror brackets. Make sure there's no missing broken nuts or studs. Make sure they're properly adjusted and they're clean. Check your handrail. Make sure it's properly attached, no visual defects. Now, you don't have to do this during the inspection, but I want you to see what you're going to be telling them you're looking for. This is your battery tray. You want to make sure that they're properly mounted. Make sure that the batteries are not leaking. Make sure that the terminals are tight. There's no corrosion. And there's no bare or broken wires. Then you like say during the test, you do not have to take this off. You just tell them you would. Put your step back on, check your latches. Make sure they latch securely. Check your steps. Make sure they're not cracked, broken, or any visual defects. Check your 3 foot of frame for cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. All right, come back here. You're going to check your load lights. Make sure they're clean, they're proper working order. Check your back window. Make sure it's clean, no visual defects, no broke. All right, this is your cab suspension. You want to check your airbags and shock. Make sure they're proper working order, they're not leaking. Check your airlines. Any airline you see, you want to check, make sure they're properly connected. There's not leaking, no visual defects. This is your drive shaft. You want to check, make sure the drive shaft, you do not have any excessive play. There's no visual defects. All right, you're going to check 3 foot of frame, cracks, broken welds, missing broken bolts. Check your airlines. Red is emergency, blue is service. Make sure they're properly connected, they're not leaking, no visual defects. Check your trailer supply wire. Make sure everything's properly connected, no bare, broken wires, no visual defects. You're going to check your 3 air tanks. Make sure the tanks are properly secured to the frame. Make sure all the lines are nice and tight, they're not leaking, there's no visual defects. You're going to check your cross member. Make sure it's got no missing bolts, no cracks, no broken welds. All right, you'll turn around right here and you can see your stuff under here. This big part in the center of the rear is called the rear end. You want to check it for any missing or broken bolts, no cracks, no leaks, no visual defects. And you can see them from right here, so you go ahead and name your 4 brake parts. Your airline, your brake pot, slack adjuster, drum and shoes. Then you'll come out here, check your quarter fender. Make sure it's properly attached, no visual defects. And then again, you got your spring hanger, you got your springs, you got your U-bolts, your axle. All right, you come out to here. Tell them I would take the cap off, check my axle housing. Make sure there's no missing or broken nuts or studs, no cracks, no leaks, no visual defects. Check your lug nuts. Make sure they're all tight, no missing or broken nuts or studs. Check your rim. Make sure there's no cracks, bends, or illegal welds. Check your valve stem. Make sure it's capped, that it's not leaking, there's no visual defects. You want to check your tires. Make sure they're not touching. If they're touching, that means they're low. All right. Tread depth on the rear, minimum of 2/32. Make sure they're not mismatched sizes or mismatched bias or radial. Make sure there's no cuts or gouges and they're properly inflated. Come back here, you're going to check your mud flap. Make sure it's properly attached. And you will want to get underneath when you do your inspection with the tester, because that way you can see everything, and you just want to mention everything you see. Make sure your flap's not ripped. It's properly mounted. Now under here, you're going to check, this is your leveling rod and valve that it's attached to. Make sure they're properly connected, no visual defects. Check your shocks. Make sure they're properly mounted, no visual defects. You want to check your airbags. Make sure they're not dry rotted, they're good shape, no visual defects. Back here you got wiring and you got airlines. Check your airlines, make sure they're not leaking. Check your wires, make sure there are no bare broken wires. This is your rear cross member. You want to check, make sure no missing broken bolts, no cracks, no broken welds. Check your taillights, make sure they're clean. They're proper working order, the wires are connected properly, no bare broken wires. All right, now we're going to go up to the fifth wheel parts. This is your fifth wheel apron. You want to make sure there's no cracks, no broken welds, no visual defects. While you're here, you're going to check your kingpin and your locking jaws. Make sure the jaws are locked around the kingpin. Make sure your release handle is all the way in. That's that handle up there that you pull to break the trailer apart. All right, this is your fifth wheel plate. Make sure there's no cracks, no visual defects. Right below that bolt on the side is your pivot pin. You want to make sure those are in and there are no visual defects. This is your fifth wheel mounting plate. Make sure there's no missing or broken bolts, no cracks, no broken welds, no visual defects. All right, let's go out. All right, now you'll come back up to here. You're going to do 3 foot of your frame. Cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. You're going to check for your trailer insurance and registration. Make sure your DOT is up to date. You're going to check your airlines. Make sure red's hooked to red for emergency, blue to blue for service. Check your trailer supply wire. Make sure it's properly connected, no bare broken wires. All right, right here, 3 foot of frame, cracks, broken welds, missing broken bolts. Right here, you got clearance lights. They're amber. You've got to make sure they're clean, they're proper working order. Lights have wires. You're going to check wires. Make sure they're properly connected, no bare broken wires. Make sure your amber reflector is not broken and clean. All right, again, 3 foot of frame, cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. Now, right here, see this bolt? Right behind that bolt, there's these wires. You can see them here. There's on this side, the trailer electrical wire and the trailer air lines. You want to make sure there's no visual defects, no leaks, no bare broken wires. All right, look up here. You want to make sure your load racks are secure. All right, next 3 foot of frame, cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. Check your landing gear support rods. Oh, wait a minute, that one's bent. I'll mention that when I get back. Make sure your landing gear, no missing or broken bolts. Make sure the landing gear's all the way up. All right, check your load door. Make sure it's properly secured. All right. Now you're going to check 3 foot of frame, cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. You're going to look up, make sure your boom is properly all the way down and properly secured. All right. Next 3 foot of frame, cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. Check your load rack. Make sure it's pinned and secured. 3 foot of frame, cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. The more you repeat yourself and the more you say everything, they're going to know what you're talking about. They're going to say, all right, next, all right, next, all right, next. Now here you got your spring hanger. You want to check for cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. What's your spring hanger do? It holds your springs. Check your springs, make sure there's no crack, misaligned springs. All right. What holds your springs to the U-bolts. Check, make sure they're tight. There's no visual defects. What do U-bolts hold to? Your axle. Make sure your axle's not bent, cracked, but no visual defects. All right. You're not going to be able to see it, but you got your 4 brake parts. You got your airline, your brake pod, slack adjuster, drum and shoes. Then you come out here, check your hub oiler. Make sure it's got the proper level. Well, this one seems like it's got a little bit of a leak. I'll mention that when I get back. No missing or broken bolts. Check your lug nuts and studs. Make sure they're tight. There's no missing or broken nuts or studs. Check your rim. Make sure there's no cracks, bends, or illegal welds. Check your valve stem. Make sure it's capped. It's not leaking. No visual defects. Check your tires. Make sure they're not touching. Make sure they're a minimum of 2/32 on the rear. Make sure they're not mismatched sizes. They're not mismatched bias or radials. Make sure there's no cuts or gouges and they're properly inflated. All right. Right here you have what's called a spring equalizer. Make sure there's no cracks, broken welds, missing or broken bolts. It holds the springs, spring hangers. Make sure there's no cracks, missing or broken bolts. Check your springs. Check your U-bolts. Check your rear end or your axle. Those 4 parts, like I say, you group them together and it's kind of easy to remember. Spring hangers do what? Hold springs. Springs are held by what? U-bolts. U-bolts hold to what?
That's axle.
All right. Now this, you have a drag link right here. You want to make sure it's properly attached. No missing broken bolts, no visual defects. Now 9 out of 10 times, if you get the whole trailer and you mention everything up to this point, they're going to tell you to skip this axle. If they don't, that means you missed something. So go back with your spring hangers, springs, our U-bolts, axle, your 4 brake parts, airline, brake pod, slack adjuster, drum and shoes. Come out here to the hub oiler. Make sure it's proper level, not leaking, no visual defects, your lug nuts, no missing nuts or studs. Make sure your rim, no cracks, bends or illegal welds. Check your valve stem, make sure it's capped, not leaking, no visual defects. Check your tires, make sure they're not touching. Minimum tread depth on the rear, 2/32. Make sure not mismatched bias or radial, not mismatched sizes. Make sure there's no cuts, gouges, and they're properly inflated. All right, back here you have your red lights. Oh, we did forget I forgot the marker light right there in the center. So make sure your rear are red, they're clean, they're proper working order. There's wires to the lights. Make sure they're properly attached, no bare broken wires, no visual defects. Back here, you've got your tail lights. Make sure your tail lights are clean, proper working order. They got wires, no bare broken wires, they're properly connected, no visual defects. Check your mud flap. Make sure it's properly attached, not ripped. Come back here to your load ramps. Make sure they're chained. Make sure they're keyed, secured. Check your tag. Make sure it's properly attached. It's clean, it's up to date. Make sure your tag light works. Make sure no bare broken wires, no visual defects. You do that, they say what's different on this side. If they don't, you just keep going around and naming everything. All right, make sure your boom's tied off. Now what's different on this side than the other side, you have your data plates. You have your landing gear crank. Oh, wait a minute. This landing gear support rod is bent. I'll mention that when I get back. But like I say, make sure when you say the landing gear crank, if you set it on the other side, say it on this side, it ain't gonna hurt. Make sure your landing gear is all the way up. Other different, oh, lost a mud flap. They'll probably, if they don't fix that, say we just lost a mud flap, but we'll mention that when we get back. All right, something else different, you have a step here. Make sure it's properly mounted, not broke, no visual defects. You have your exhaust heat shield. Make sure no missing broken bolts, no visual defects. Check your muffler, which is inside. Make sure it's properly mounted, no leaks, no visual defects. Check your clamps. Make sure your exhaust clamps are tight, not leaking. All right, you have your fuel tank hangers. Make sure your fuel tank hangers, no missing broken bolts, no cracks, they're tight. Check your steps. Make sure they're not broken, no missing broken bolts, no visual defects. Check your fuel sending unit wires. Make sure they're properly connected, no bare broken wires. You're going to check your fuel. You should have on-road fuel only. I would open it, make sure I have enough fuel. I'd put my cap back on, make sure my cap works properly. All right, you do that, and then that passes the outside inspection. All right, we'll get to the inside.
It's just a slit.
it gonna bother anybody if I smoke?
No.
Y'all all right?
Yeah.
All right. Now, the first thing, once you finish that outside, they're going to have you get inside the truck. And then what he's going to do, first thing, he or she, they're going to have you check the lights. But first thing you get in the truck, what's the first thing you do?
Seatbelt.
As soon as you sit down, you put your seatbelt on. And then they're going to have you turn on the lights. And then they're going to ask you for high beam, which is the button on the end of this turn signal. You're going to do your left, right. Then they're going to go to the back. Check the left, right, and then the brake pedal. They're going to check brake lights. All right. Now, once they check those, they're going to get inside. The first thing you do when they get inside, you're going to couple and uncouple your seatbelt. You're checking your seatbelt, make sure it works, couples right. And then check your seat, make sure it's properly attached to the floor. Now, while you're on safety stuff, you go ahead and name your 3 safety devices: your fire extinguisher, your triangles, and your spare fuses. All right. Then you're going to go ahead, open and shut the door a couple times. You checked it from the outside, but you want to check it from the inside, make sure the inside handle works. All right, then you're going to roll your window up and down a couple times, make sure the crank works. Then you're going to make sure your mirrors are adjusted properly and they're clean. While you're at that point, you're going to move this way. And I always start from the dash and work your way up. You've already checked them on the outside, but if you forgot to check them, here's another chance for you to get them. Check my wiper arms and blades. Make sure they're proper working order, no visual defects. Check my windshields. Make sure they're clean. There's no visual defects. Now, this will be on the floor. You want to take and make sure, do this. Make sure your visors are not going to drop down on you while you're going down the road. All right. While you're here, don't forget your air horn and city horn. Group them together. All right. Next thing you're going to do is you're going to tell them you're going to do a safe start. Put it in neutral. Push in the clutch.
And the brake.
No, you don't have to touch the brake because your brakes are already on. Go ahead, start it. Once it starts, make sure it's in neutral, let off on the clutch. As soon as the gauge you start, you want to start measuring your gauges. Say my RPM gauge is at proper operating range. My oil pressure is within proper operating range. My water temperature is within proper operating range. My speedometer we can't check till we start moving. My battery volts are within proper